My name is Georg Steinberger and I'm managing this channel. We have a very experienced guest today, one of the best informed people in the entire global electronics manufacturing industry, in my opinion. So welcome, Phil Stoten.
Thank you, Georg, and that's a very kind and very nice introduction. Thank you for that.
It gets even better. Phil, I start each conversation with the same request. Please give me your 30 seconds elevator pitch on your company or your activities.
Okay, so I started my career designing printed circuit boards 40 years ago. I spent the first 15 or so years active in the EMS industry. I switched to journalism. I started a couple of publications, one of which I still own, EMSnow. And from that, I span out a marketing company called Scoop, which I would describe as the preeminent consultancy for marketing and strategy in the electronic manufacturing ecosystem.
Very good. So thanks for that. I think you even stayed within the time frame of 30 seconds.
There you go.
Let me start with the first question. I guess that everyone in the industry in the meantime is clear what really happened over the last 2 years and why it actually happened. The big question that remains is what now? What will happen now? And I'm passing the question to you. So which trends do you see in the electronics manufacturing industry this year and beyond? You know, financial, inventory, challenges, but also opportunities.
Yeah, I think it's really, we're at a really interesting time, and it's a mixture of optimism and uncertainty at the moment. I think when I speak to particularly EMS companies, but also to OEMs and people in the component industry, there's a combination of optimism and pragmatic concern. And, you know, even just the last few weeks of banking crisis in the US and threats there have kind of shifted sentiment. So it's almost like every week you speak to someone and it's a different story. When I look at the EMS companies that are in sectors that aren't consumer driven, they're still seeing really good order intake. So automotive, medical, industrial, IoT, they're seeing plenty of opportunity out there. They're also seeing, because there is a bit of a softening and there's component availability, an opportunity to catch up on their backlog. And by catching up on their backlog, it's an opportunity to reduce their inventory. And I think within inventory, there is some sense of risk. I think they've underestimated the risk, and I think they've actually got more danger of inventory overhang than perhaps they think. I think the last big trend we're seeing is this big geopolitical shift where everybody's thinking much harder about the idea of friendshoring and ally shoring, where they should be manufacturing. And I'm hoping the outcome of that is more regional, shorter supply chains that are more sustainable.
So we will cover that in one of the later questions, but I'm still interested in what's happening at the EMS company. So we had our little discussion this morning in the Distribution Association on the general mood and the situation actually specifically on the order side, and we really see a slowdown or a correction or a consolidation, depending on how you want to see it. So it's a lower order intake, but still relatively high revenue. And the question would be, what is the mood in the EMS industry? You just touch it. They see a lot of opportunities, but also a potential inventory problem.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the difference between component distribution and maybe the EMS industry, part of what happens in the EMS industry is sometimes they're fueling inventory and sometimes they're running that inventory down. So that's like, it's like a huge fuel tank or a huge battery that they fill up, and it's pretty full at the moment. So their objective would be to get that 10% of parts that have stopped them delivering a product and ship the product as a result of that, which means the component industry gets 10% of the business that is 100% of the output. So there's a difference in those dynamics. I think that pragmatic optimism is the key. I think there's still, I haven't spoken to an EMS that has had a real negative feeling. I've spoken to statisticians and people that really study the industry carefully. And actually, it's interesting to see that in 2022, the weakest performers were the Taiwanese-owned EMS companies, and the best performers were the Europeans, and the Americans sat nicely in the middle. So, you know, it's the first time that we've seen that dynamic in a long time. You know, the growth at Foxtron, Pegatron was small single digit. In Europe, it was double digit. In the US, it was typically around about 10%. So there's some optimism there. There's also, I think, some learnings that have come out of the last 2 years. One is that we need much tighter collaborations and much tighter partnerships with our OEMs, and the EMS companies, as they've had to constantly go back to their customers with bad news, they have managed to develop a stickier, more collaborative and more open relationship. And I think alongside that, they see opportunities to grow their business by doing more for those OEMs. So more kind of cradle to grave opportunities, design all the way down through to end of life, but also to grow the total available market, because in Europe at the moment, only around about 41% of electronic manufacturing is outsourced. So there's, you know, a 59% opportunity there in increasing the TAM. And if you can increase the total available market, that's a rising tide that lifts all boats.
Okay, so that's something that we in distribution always say in a similar way. So we have 30% of the market, so there's a 70% opportunity, but somehow with all the customer transfers that have happened in the last 20 years, it never really materialized, so that distribution actually went beyond this 1/3 of the market, except maybe in, I would say, smaller countries where manufacturers are not that present. Now, the partnership question that you mentioned, don't you think that it would also be reasonable to start or to look at a better partnership between distribution and EMS companies? Because I think there's always a bit of finger pointing and blaming and a bit of friction that potentially doesn't need to be there if the understanding for each other's business model would be a bit better.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you, Georg, and we must have talked about this over coffee and croissant many times. It's so much easier to be nice to your customers than it is to be nice to your suppliers. And it's that idea that the customer's always right. Sometimes the supplier's right and they know better. And when I look at the component distribution industry, I think it's got a bit of it's an identity issue between itself and the EMS industry. I don't think the two industries have understood each other well enough. And I think in the last 2 years, the EMS industry has maybe felt that the component distribution industry has profited from their misfortune. And that kind of gives them an uncomfortable feeling. I don't think they have deliberately, but if they have, then, you know, that's just a matter of fact. I think what needs to happen is the component distribution industry needs to do a much better job of communicating the value it adds to the EMS industry. And perhaps it's done a great job, and we've just chosen to ignore it within the EMS industry. But the EMS industry also needs to say, come on inside, let's talk about how we can have a better relationship going forward. Because 5 years ago, when we were talking about digital transformation, everybody was talking about the glass factory and the idea that I could see the dynamics of what was happening in a factory and what machine my product was on, and that would give me huge value. Nobody cares about that anymore. All they want to talk about is a glass pipeline. How can I see where everything in my supply chain is, and how can I map scenarios if this particular part is difficult to get hold of, and how can I have a strategy that allows me to switch to another part or switch to another supplier if I need to. And the component distribution industry can do a great job of helping the EMS industry to achieve that.
I'm pretty sure maybe the discussion was too much about I would say, part prices and not too much about cost of ownership, and also not too much about pain points that exist in the supply chain that could have been solved in working together more better. Yeah. So, but you actually touch a point. So the digitalization of the supply chain is really the major topic of sourceability. They are developing tools in that direction that really go beyond the actual transaction automation. And I really want to touch that because it's important. It will change the way we interact also beyond the order or beyond the actual deliveries. It's really about the information around the product that we really haven't exploited over the last 20 years. And in distribution, I always was waiting for something like a digital tool that can tell me what kind of risks certain components will actually encompass when you buy them. And this is now about to happen. And the question is, what do you see in that area, in that sector? What is developing, and is it really enough to make the supply chain more glassy or more resilient?
Yeah, I think there's a combination. I think transparency is huge. I always look at the EMS industry and feel that, you know, the component industry to a degree does the same as the EMS industry, and that's why we haven't grown the total available market. We look at the market we've got and we think, how can we steal business from our competitors and grow our business that way? We don't think, how can we convince more people to outsource? How can we convince more people to go to component distribution? So we need to learn a little bit about that and think a little bit about how we communicate our value to our partners. But when I look at that digital supply chain or the digitalization of the supply chain, I think there's just such a huge upside. When I'm encouraging brands to look at EMS companies, I always say to a brand, you need to think of them as your complete manufacturing partner. So everything that's involved in manufacturing your product, from design for manufacture, from ramping from prototype to volume, all the way through to end of life, fulfillment, all of that, you can let someone else do that, and you can concentrate on developing great products and marketing them. In the same way, the EMS industry should be able to say, when I look at my component supply chain, is there a component supply chain tool or a set of tools or a set of vendors that can do the same for me? You know, I'm a company that exists on the basis of people outsourcing to me. I should understand the value of outsourcing. So can I find myself in a position through supply chain tools and through the right partnerships that all of my component supply chain is very, very visible, very transparent. I can see where stuff is, I can manage scenarios, I can look at scenarios, I can collaborate within my team on those tools, I can collaborate with my suppliers. I've got reliable data that is really fast, preferably in real time, and that's essential. And what I see at the moment when I look out at the industry, there are companies like you mentioned that are doing some really good stuff, and there are some really interesting, very small startups that are using AI maybe and doing doing some clever stuff. There are some in Silicon Valley, there are some in Munich that we both know about. But I think there are really good opportunities there, and for me the key is
to connect this
EMS supplier to understand and having that whole ecosystem connected.
I think this discussion hasn't really happened to a large extent. A lot of the industry is really organized in islands, but islands aren't really transparent or, let's say, or providing this glassy this glass pipeline. I think what you ultimately would need is really the state of components, the information about components across the entire supply chain, to make sure that there is a platform where this could be seen more holistically rather than in little pockets. It doesn't mean that cyclicality will go away that way. Guess that we will, even in 10, 15 years, discuss about allocation and abundance in the same way, but I think it will get better. Maybe the cycles will get a little bit less painful. That could eventually be. Except for the memory guys, they always jump off the cliff.
Pain's okay when you know it's coming. You know, if you go in a hospital and they're gonna cut something, they'll give you an anesthetic and you're prepared for it. If it's a surprise and it happens when you're at the supermarket, it's not so much fun. So visibility is really important, and early warnings and scenarios.
I read an interesting quote on a wall in an Ukrainian city yesterday, in a picture that I saw on the internet, said, "Fear is temporary, regret is forever."
Yeah.
And maybe that is also true a little bit for the way how we operate in our industry. Maybe we need to talk more to regret less.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. That's a good quote.
Switching back to the overall geopolitics, so you already mentioned that. I think deglobalization is actually the wrong term. What I'm seeing is a globalization -1. And you also mentioned that there might be opportunities around this for Europe, but also for maybe other regions in the world.
Yeah, I think there absolutely are. And I think the geopolitical thing is really interesting. I recently wrote a piece about friend shoring or ally shoring. And as I wrote it, I was really struggling with the relationship we have with certain of our geographies with respect to supply. And then, you know, it's kind of an addiction to low-cost product, and almost like a lemming-like march towards the Far East and chasing low-cost labor around the world. And, you know, I guess in retrospect, it's easy to say that we should have seen this coming, but retrospect is 2020 vision, and we didn't have that. So what I absolutely agree with you. You know, the global dynamics are changing. I see companies that are particularly EMS companies that are too heavily in China being really challenged by that, and it's really hard to move that footprint quickly. I see companies that have a much bigger mix within Asia doing better. So those countries that we relied on for decades, like Malaysia and Thailand, are now more in fashion again, and are actually very, very capable. And I see people scaling there. Mexico, I think, is a huge opportunity.
What about the US and Europe? You know, we are not the typical low-cost regions.
Yeah, and they're seeing their own challenges. Obviously, as we look harder towards them, there are issues with respect to talent, and you know that issue there of wages rising. I think as we try to shift to a greater level of automation, we should see a lower dependency on low-cost labor, which means we can build up muscle in higher cost regions, which I think is a great thing. And when I look at it from a point of view of how the industry should look, I think we need to just shift to shorter supply chains. We need to have supply chains that don't, you know, when you look at some products, there's so much movement in the parts that come
million milers.
Yeah, PCBs come from Asia, components come from somewhere else. They get assembled
around the world,
Europe, they get sent somewhere else. Yeah, and it goes round and round and round, and there are way too many miles in there. So I think that regionalization of the supply chain, that shift away from globalization, and I don't mean just like, okay, we're done with those countries, we're not going to buy anymore. I think just a more sensible supply chain makes sense. I think the challenges are that we let too much go. So particularly in the semiconductor industry, but also in printed circuit boards. So it's hard, and it takes a long time for it to come back, and governments are prepared to invest in that. But I don't think they understand how difficult it is to make semiconductors, or how difficult it is to rebuild an industry
to build an ecosystem.
Yeah, when you've let talent go. I think another country that's really interesting, Georg, that I think is going to kick on in the next couple of years is India. And we have to decide whether they're really our friends. So there's a lot to unpack in the supply chain. We shouldn't have a political discussion, but I think people need to be aware of that when they're thinking about how they design their manufacturing ecosystem and their supply chain.
It's funny that you mentioned India, because a year ago I contacted an Indian journalist exactly on the topic. What about India and an Indian semiconductor company, or a bigger involvement in the business? And there was very little. In the meantime, you see India in the news around semiconductors almost every day, every week is something new. It's happening, right?
Yeah, and I think Apple are pushing towards 15% iPhone manufacturing being
yeah.
there. So I think when you see companies like Apple move in, if you put an Apple
The rest
or a
moves as well.
Foxconn Apple campus, that an ecosystem has to build around it.
Yeah.
And when I look at where we are in India, it's pretty early stages, but I look back to 99 when the US industry decided Guadalajara was a good place to go. 2 or 3 of the big EMS companies went, they built big facilities, and they built like strip malls for all their suppliers to follow them in, and very quickly a supply chain and ecosystem built around them.
But that's interesting. It leads me really to the next question. It's a big topic in the meantime in Europe. It's a big topic probably everywhere around the world, specifically in the countries that are developed and that have let go a little bit of the production. It's the question of skilled workers. So if you just read that TSMC takes 6,000 people out of the university, freshmen from university, to start to help them start working at TSMC, it's mind-boggling. We don't have 6,000 students coming out of European university in 5 years that are going into our industry. It's a pity.
Well, I think it's a pity, and I think it's partly because we have not done a good job of marketing the industry to young people. So they'd rather go in, they'd rather be lawyers or doctors, and their parents want them to be lawyers and doctors.
Social media influencers.
In dirty, dangerous factories. The truth of the matter is they're not dirty and they're not dangerous, and it's a pretty good business to be in, and it's pretty, there are some very sustainable, very high quality, well paid careers to be had, but we haven't let the world know that. So there's a challenge there. Obviously, Asia is cranking out thousands and thousands of graduates, and we have a relatively small number. So there's a challenge there, but we need to make manufacturing a little bit sexier for young people, or a little bit more appealing. One of the issues is that if they watch this show, they'll see 2 grey-haired old white men as role models. There needs to be
absolutely
much more diversity at board level within organizations. And, I work on as board of advisor to several companies. Yeah. When we talk about diversity, I always say, well, this is a great place to start. If you're struggling to recruit women to the C-suite, recruit them to your board of advisors first, because that is much lighter lifting and allows you to get a much better view of what's going on in the industry, and then kind of build from there. I think on the talent,
I fully agree.
Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. I actually I started a discussion within our association here in Germany about what could we do against the labor, the lack of skilled labor. Is really the natural question is, why don't you give women a much better chance in this industry? Why don't you make it more interesting actually in the companies to work, to actually balance your private life, children, whatever, with a career? And that's just one point. The other one is, why firing all the 60-year-old guys who are still capable and willing to work if you can't find anyone else? And the third one is, you have to start in schools to make technology a little bit more attractive, not something that people shouldn't touch or that is invisible, but really something that is a miracle. So when I was 9 years old, I sat in front of the TV and watched the moon landing. We need something like that, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to say, we're building products that go into space. We're creating the hardware on which artificial intelligence exists. Without the electronic manufacturing industry, we wouldn't have any of the social media that we have. We wouldn't have, most of the labor saving devices. We wouldn't have the computers that you and I are speaking on. So there's lots there.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing to consider in terms of mitigating the shortage of talent is, are we doing a good enough job with the automation we've got? Because by increasing the automation that we utilize, I think we actually create more interesting and more dynamic and more exciting jobs. And we also make our industry more efficient and competitive. So I think that's good. And I think there are companies doing some really great stuff. Yeah. And I'm really interested in the trend I'm seeing at the moment in robotics as a service, where they're kind of flipping the business model from CapEx to OpEx and creating some interesting opportunities there. So I think I think there is some movement there, but there's a huge amount of effort required.
I actually wrote an article for a book just 2 years ago about machine learning, and I thought that this is actually also another opportunity to make working in manufacturing environment more interesting, because you are interacting with a totally different intelligent or halfway intelligent infrastructure that helps you understanding it better, helps you maintaining it better, but also helps the infrastructure interacting better with the humans who are in the factory. And I would say in the future, the humans in the factory are potentially much more responsible jobs or occupations than what we had in the past, not just putting something together, but really monitoring an entire fleet of manufacturing facilities or so.
And troubleshooting and managing them and managing the supply chain. And, the supply chain tools you talked about, the digital transformation of the supply chain in itself is creating some interesting jobs. And when I look at the EMS companies I work with in the last 2 years, the supply chain leadership and the supply chain team have been the rock stars. They're the people that everybody is asking to go that extra mile. What can you do? How can you find this? How can you resolve that? And it's, I meet those people constantly. It's an exciting role to be in, and it's very fulfilling because they're able to solve problems that maybe other people are struggling with.
And half of them are talking about digital tools, many of them using AI as some basics of actually interpreting, analyzing the data completely differently than what we did manually in the past. And that is, in my opinion, also another opportunity, future driver for the components market, but potentially also for the EMS guys as our end customers, not just the entire e-mobility, but also AI. I think AI potentially is a major hardware driver in the future. And you see it happening. Almost every architecture core in the meantime has an AI accelerator. So the way how the things work in the future and bring results in the future will be much faster. But apart from e-mobility and AI as drivers for our industry, so my final question actually to you, and then we should be done for today. Is there anything missing? Is there anything missing in that future drivers that I haven't mentioned? So EV, AI as the main cores, and then what else?
I think EV's huge. One comment I would make on the EV issue, which I'm really fascinated by and I'm watching really closely, is how do the incumbents in the industry, like the Volvos, the Fords, the Mercedes and BMWs, meet the challenge of the new kids on the block like Tesla and Rivian and all those. So I'm really excited to see how that plays out. Both of them,
the Chinese markets,
electronics, or BYD or companies like that. Exactly. AI is going to change everything from how you and I work to how the electronics industry works. It does an awesome job of bringing together a huge amount of data, which is hard for us to manage, and delivering it to us in a digestible way that allows us to make better decisions. So I think of it as the ultimate co-pilot, and I'm really excited to see how that develops. When I look at other drivers in the industry, I see it as this idea of smart everything. So, in the last few years, we've gone from a doorbell, which is basically an electric switch that makes a bell ring, to something where I can look on my phone and I can see where the Amazon delivery guy has rung my doorbell and has dropped something off. So, when I look at that in terms of locks, I look at that in terms of the thermostat in my house, the deviceification of every single thing, I think is still and continues to be a huge opportunity. So it just creates more and more products. The other industry that I think is really interesting is medicine.
It's funny that about 30 years ago I wrote an editorial for my magazine back then that was called Personal Silicon. The idea was really that the silicon around you as a person, that you directly have in use all the time is growing immensely, and that really has happened. And I'm not just meaning computer and smartphone. It's all the little things that are adding up to something that is almost your own personal silicon cloud that has data, produces data, tells you what to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. You're absolutely right. It grows and grows. And sadly, we lost Mr. Moore from Intel, but Moore's law remains, and it will remain, and we will have more and more technology in our lives. And generally, that means more and more hardware as well as more and more software.
Let's talk again when we are reaching 1 nanometer or below, if Moore's law is still working back then or out then. But that's actually a good conclusion. Hey, Phil, I thank you very much for your participation. I hope that we see each other in the near-term future again, speaking about, if our ideas in April 2023 actually really came to fruition by the end of the year or so. And wish you a good time in Down Under, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.